Patrick de la Cerda had everything, until Soren Delvane stepped out of the shadows and pulled the trigger, all under the direction of a bitter ex-boyfriend, Andrix Hale, who believed murder was the only way to reclaim what he'd lost. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a calculated execution, caught by the one thing no one expected: a secret camera hidden in plain sight. The morning of February 27, 2025, began like any other for Patrick de la Cerda, a quiet and soft-spoken 25-year-old man who had built a simple life for himself in the peaceful surroundings of Volusia County, Florida. Nestled in a secluded residential area surrounded by trees and stillness, Patrick's home was modest, but it carried a special warmth. He lived alone, but was engaged to a woman he adored, and he had spent months preparing for a future with her. On that morning, he was expecting a special delivery, an engagement ring he had custom-ordered to propose formally to Meliora Vance, the woman he called the love of his life. Patrick had plans. His day was supposed to begin with excitement, nerves, and hope. Patrick was meticulous. He had arranged for the ring to arrive early that morning, knowing Meliora would be visiting later that week. He planned to show it to her, maybe even propose that weekend. He had been pacing around his house since sunrise, checking the front door every few minutes, eager for the knock that never came. But while he waited, someone else had been watching him. Someone who knew his schedule. Someone who knew that on this specific morning he would be alone, distracted and unarmed. Hours later, Patrick's lifeless body was discovered lying in the walkway near his front door. He had been shot multiple times, once in the head, twice in the chest. The shots were close range, efficient, and silent. There were no screams, no shattered windows, no signs of a struggle. His phone had fallen nearby, untouched. Nothing in the house was taken. There were no signs of forced entry. His wallet and valuables were still in his pocket. It didn't look like a robbery. It didn't feel like a random act of violence. It looked like someone had waited for the perfect moment to strike, and they had succeeded. When deputies arrived, the scene was hauntingly calm. The air smelled of pine and iron. Neighbors gathered silently at the edge of the yellow tape, whispering in confusion. Patrick was known to everyone as kind, gentle, and quiet, the type of man who fed stray cats and never raised his voice. Why would anyone want to kill him? Detectives began collecting evidence immediately, but there was very little to go on. No witnesses, no security footage from the surrounding area. No one reported hearing gunshots. The shell casings had been removed, likely by the shooter. Whoever did this had planned it well. News of Patrick's death spread quickly. Meliora Vance arrived at the scene just hours later, collapsing in grief when she saw the flashing lights and the ambulance. She couldn't understand what had happened. Just the night before, they had exchanged texts about the ring, about dinner plans for the weekend. Everything had been normal. But now, the life they were building was gone in an instant. Detectives began their investigation by digging into Patrick's personal life. They questioned his friends, co-workers, and of course, Meliora. What they found painted a picture of a man with no known enemies, no shady financial dealings, no criminal record, no romantic affairs. Patrick was clean. Too clean. Which only made the murder more suspicious. If this wasn't a crime of passion or revenge, then what was it? They pulled his phone records, analyzed GPS data, checked his recent contacts, but nothing raised immediate concern. But something strange did stand out. Patrick had made several complaints over the past few weeks about someone following him. He hadn't reported it officially to police, but he had mentioned it to Meliora in private. He told her he felt like he was being watched, like someone was always a few steps behind him. At the time, Meliora thought he was just stressed. But now, those comments took on a much darker meaning. Investigators had no solid leads yet, but a shadow had started to form around the case. Whoever killed Patrick hadn't just stumbled upon him. They had been watching, waiting, and they knew exactly when to strike. And they had gotten away with it. For now. Detectives knew early on that the answer to Patrick de la Cerda's murder would lie somewhere within the people closest to him. While his life appeared spotless on the surface, the fact that someone had taken the time to plan such a quiet, precise execution meant there had to be deeper layers. They began with Meliora Vance, his fiancée. She was cooperative, visibly devastated, and willing to answer anything. Still, investigators knew from experience that love stories often hold secrets, especially when emotions run deep and past relationships leave scars. Meliora explained that she and Patrick had met just over a year ago and quickly grown inseparable. They shared plans of moving in together, starting a family, and building a life away from the noise of the world. But not everything had been peaceful. Patrick had confided in her over the past month that something felt wrong. He had started getting strange texts from unknown numbers. Most were vague, odd phrases, cryptic messages, but a few were directly threatening. One even told him to watch his doorstep. Meliora didn't see the messages herself, but Patrick told her he was planning to change his number. She now regretted brushing it off. Investigators pressed further. Who could have wanted Patrick dead? Meliora hesitated before naming one person, Andrix Hale, her former boyfriend. He was part of her past, but not entirely out of the picture. Before she met Patrick, she had been in a long, toxic relationship with Andrix. It had ended badly, with emotional manipulation, obsessive behavior, and a few disturbing encounters that forced her to cut all ties. But Andrix didn't let go easily. According to Meliora, he continued to message her for months after they broke up. He even showed up once at her workplace, demanding to know who she was seeing. She never told Patrick the full extent of it, afraid it would only make him paranoid. But now, it seemed those fears were well-founded. Detectives pulled up Andrix Hale's background. What they found was concerning. A history of controlling behavior, a protective order filed by a previous partner, and several altercations involving anger issues. He had no current criminal charges, but his reputation wasn't clean. Investigators brought him in for questioning. He was calm, almost too calm. He denied having any contact with Patrick. He admitted he had loved Meliora and was hurt when she left, but he insisted he had moved on. Andrix's alibi was shaky. He claimed he was at a friend's house the morning of the murder but couldn't remember the address clearly. There were no receipts, no cell phone pings that proved his location. Still, without physical evidence or witness statements, detectives had little to hold him on. They let him go but marked him as a person of interest. Back at Patrick's house, forensic teams combed every inch for anything they might have missed. The shooter had been cautious. No fingerprints, no footprints, no shell casings. It was almost as if the person had known exactly what they were doing. But a few subtle details caught their eye. The front doormat had been moved slightly, suggesting someone stood there for a while. A bush nearby had a snapped branch, and in the grass beside it, a small dent showed where someone may have crouched. The killer had likely waited outside for Patrick to open the door. It wasn't a break-in. It was an ambush. Patrick had trusted that knock. Maybe he even knew who he was opening the door for. Detectives revisited Patrick's recent activity. His laptop showed internet searches for private investigators and hidden cameras. His last email had been to a surveillance company asking for recommendations on discrete indoor monitoring systems. It was sent just 3 days before his death. That email shifted the tone of the investigation. Patrick had known something was coming. He may not have known who or why, but he sensed danger. The tragic part was he had been right. And now, the race was on to find whether he had managed to record anything before it was too late. The killer had erased most signs of their presence, but they had no idea that something small, something hidden, might still be watching. Weeks passed with little progress in Patrick de la Cerda's case. Leads had thinned out, and while suspicion hovered over Andrix Hale, nothing linked him directly to the murder. The grief that hung over Patrick's family slowly began turning into frustration. His parents, especially his father, couldn't rest knowing his son's killer was still out there. Determined to bring some sense of order to the house and perhaps find peace, they began the painful process of clearing Patrick's belongings. As they sorted through drawers, closets, and shelves, they came across various personal items, photo albums, unopened mail, and neatly organized receipts. Then, while dusting the hallway, Patrick's father noticed something odd. A smoke detector near the ceiling had a tiny, blinking red light. It was the only one in the house showing that light, and he didn't remember Patrick ever mentioning installing new alarms. Curiosity turned to suspicion. He removed the device, took it down, and opened the back. Inside was a tiny lens, barely noticeable unless one knew what to look for. It was a hidden camera. Patrick's father immediately handed the device over to investigators. They took it into evidence and sent it for analysis. The tech team retrieved the micro SD card, hoping to find anything of value. What they discovered changed the entire course of the case. The hidden camera had been active for nearly 3 weeks. Most of the recordings were uneventful, footage of Patrick walking through the hallway, brushing his teeth, checking his phone. There was no audio, just grainy video. But as investigators scrubbed through the timeline, one particular date stood out. February 27th, the day Patrick was murdered. At 6:42 a.m., the camera picked up Patrick standing near the door, glancing out the window. He appeared nervous but calm. At 6:45, he disappeared out of frame, likely walking toward the front entrance. Just 30 seconds later, the camera captured movement again. A shadow passed through the hallway. Then, the figure of a man entered the edge of the frame. He moved, slowly, wearing dark clothes and gloves. His face wasn't fully visible, but what the camera did catch was chilling. The man paused in front of a glass display cabinet for a split second. The angle was poor, but in that fleeting moment, the cabinet's reflection showed a distorted glimpse of the man's face. Investigators froze the frame. It was blurry, but certain features stood out: a distinct jawline, the corner of a tattoo peeking out from beneath the collar, and something even more telling: a limp in his right leg as he walked away. The footage had no audio, but the silence of that moment spoke volumes. Whoever this man was, he knew what he was doing. He had waited until Patrick opened the door, entered with confidence, committed the murder swiftly, and exited without leaving a trace. But what he didn't know was that he had left behind the most dangerous thing of all: a partial image of himself. Detectives enhanced the reflection as much as they could. It wasn't enough to make a full identification, but it gave them valuable leads. They began comparing the distorted facial features and tattoo placement with known offenders in the area. It didn't take long before someone stood out: Soren Delvane, a former felon with a history of burglary and surveillance-related crimes. He had previously served time for installing illegal hidden cameras in private properties and had known ties to none other than Andrix Hale. The discovery was electrifying. While Soren wasn't listed anywhere in Patrick's phone records, the reflection in the footage, combined with his background, made him the first new solid suspect since the early stages of the investigation. Detectives requested surveillance of Soren's home. They tracked his movements, analyzed his phone usage, and began putting together a digital profile. Meanwhile, they brought the reflection image to several forensic imaging experts to confirm its probability of being him. It wasn't just the face that matched, it was the tattoo. Soren had a symbol tattooed on his neck that was partially visible in the cabinet's reflection. The same design appeared in old arrest photos, and that detail, as faint as it was, began turning suspicion into certainty. Patrick had unknowingly captured his killer. And now, the camera he installed to protect himself had delivered the first real break in a case many feared would go cold. The grainy reflection captured in the glass cabinet was the silent witness detectives had been desperately searching for. Though blurred and fragmented, it offered just enough to open a door that had been locked for weeks. The partial image of a tattoo and the subtle limp led investigators to a man who had long flown under the radar, Soren Delvane. With a criminal record that included illegal surveillance, theft, and breaking and entering, Soren was known for slipping into places unnoticed and leaving without a trace. His quiet demeanor and methodical approach made him dangerous in a way few others were. He wasn't reckless. He was calculated. The link between Soren and Andrix Hale added a new layer to the already suspicious narrative. During his time in a halfway house 2 years prior, Soren had developed a friendship with Andrix. The two had kept in occasional contact since then. While nothing on the surface tied them directly to Patrick, detectives suspected this relationship was the thread connecting motive to execution. If Andrix was the mind behind the murder, Soren could have easily been the hand. Undercover surveillance teams were deployed to monitor Soren's daily movements. He kept a low profile, working odd hours at a garage and spending most of his time alone. He used prepaid phones, avoided social media, and rarely made any digital footprint. But even the most careful individuals leave trails. After securing warrants, detectives examined his bank activity, email history, and messaging platforms. What they found was subtle, but telling. Several weeks before Patrick's murder, Soren had received a series of wire transfers totaling $4,000 from a third-party cryptocurrency wallet. The source of those funds was anonymous, but the timing lined up precisely with the period Patrick began receiving threatening messages. The amounts were broken into small portions and spread out over multiple days, a classic tactic to avoid detection. That raised enough suspicion for detectives to bring Soren in for questioning. He arrived at the station without a lawyer, quiet and composed. At first, he claimed to know nothing about Patrick de la Cerda or Meliora Vance. But when detectives presented the blurry image from the hidden camera, his body language shifted. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he leaned forward to study the image. The photo showed a side profile, half covered by the doorframe and reflected through glass, but the edge of the tattoo was unmistakable. When they showed him older mugshots that matched the tattoo and his gait, Soren leaned back and went silent. For several minutes, he said nothing. Then, he asked for a break. When the interview resumed, Soren didn't confess to the murder directly. Instead, he made a vague admission. He had been in the area that morning. He offered a weak excuse, saying he had gone for a walk and happened to pass by the house. But that explanation didn't align with the time-stamped footage or his phone records, which showed his device had been turned off hours before the killing, a sign of someone trying to avoid being tracked. Detectives pushed harder. They showed him transaction logs. They asked about the source of the cryptocurrency payments. When he couldn't explain them, the pressure mounted. Soren began to crack, not entirely, but enough to open a crucial path in the investigation. While he refused to name the person who hired him, his hesitation and contradictions told detectives everything they needed to know. A follow-up search of Soren's storage unit, obtained through a warrant, turned up several incriminating items: burner phones, surveillance gear, and clothing that matched what was seen in the footage. Most damning of all was a crumpled receipt for ammunition, dated just days before the murder. The evidence was adding up. Still, the question remained: who pulled the strings? Detectives circled back to Andrix Hale. The money trail, the motive, the history, all roads pointed to him. And now, with Soren Delvane indirectly confirming he'd been hired, it was only a matter of connecting the final dots. They dug deeper into digital communications, knowing that somewhere in the encrypted messages and masked transactions, the truth was hiding. The killer had slipped in and out, believing he'd left no trace. But a single reflection, a blink of red light, and one faint symbol on his skin were enough to begin the unraveling. Justice was no longer a distant hope. It was closing in fast. The final phase of the investigation into Patrick de la Cerda's murder was unfolding with relentless momentum. The reflection in the hidden camera had given detectives a face. The discovery of Soren Delvane's link to Andrix Hale had given them a direction. But the most important piece was still missing: a direct connection between the mastermind and the hitman. The evidence against Soren was solid. His presence at the scene, his limp, his tattoo, the burner phones, and the hidden surveillance gear were undeniable. Yet, investigators knew he wasn't acting alone. He was a tool. Someone else had provided the motive. Someone else had paid for silence. They turned back to the source of the crypto payments. While the trail was designed to be untraceable, digital forensics uncovered a clue hidden in the fine print of a transaction, a login from a location that pinged briefly before the VPN masked it again. The location was a coffee shop, just 2 miles from where Andrix Hale lived. Investigators visited the shop, retrieved CCTV footage from the day of the login, and there he was, Andrix, sitting with a laptop, headphones in, glancing around nervously. It wasn't proof on its own, but paired with everything else, it gave prosecutors the push they needed to move. Armed with a fresh warrant, detectives raided Andrix Hale's residence. His calm facade cracked the moment officers entered. They seized his electronic devices, searching for anything that would tie him to the payment trail. The encryption on his devices was strong, but not impenetrable. Weeks of patient digital work unearthed files buried deep, hidden message logs, encrypted chats, deleted transfer screenshots. The most critical message came from a conversation between Andrix and a username labeled Aviator6. It read, "He opens the door at 6:45, no cams, in and out, leave nothing. Payment confirmed." The timestamp matched the morning of February 27th. More messages followed in code. Some were clearly rehearsed phrases, short and direct. One read, "Final step, clean. No souvenirs." Another, days after the murder, "Handled. She won't. Suspect me. Keep quiet." Investigators confirmed that Aviator 6 was Andrix. A handwriting expert compared notes from his previous job applications to a physical notebook found in his home containing the same phrasing used in the chats. The walls were closing in. Andrix was brought in again. This time he didn't smile. He didn't ask questions. When he was shown the footage, the receipts, and the chat logs, he stayed silent. For hours, detectives waited, watching him fidget, blink, shift. Then, slowly, he spoke. He claimed it wasn't about jealousy, it was about betrayal. He said Patrick had stolen the future he was supposed to have. That Meliora was meant to come back to him, and Patrick had brainwashed her. It was twisted. Logic, but it exposed a deeper truth. He couldn't handle losing. Not control, not love, not pride. Andrix didn't confess in detail. He never admitted to paying Soren or planning the murder directly. But the evidence no longer needed his confession. Prosecutors had everything they needed. Both men were indicted. Soren Delvane was charged with first-degree murder. Andrix Hale, with conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation of murder, and tampering with evidence. In court, the footage from the hidden camera played silently while Patrick's family watched in tears. The flicker of a shadow, the reflection of a man who thought he was invisible, was now the loudest testimony in the room. The jury took just 3 days. Both were found guilty. Soren received life without parole. Andrix was sentenced to 40 years, with the possibility of parole only after serving 30. For Meliora and Patrick's family, justice came too late to save him. But it came. In the quiet town where Patrick once planned a future, his story became a reminder of how far obsession can go when it festers in silence. A hidden camera, bought in fear, had become the only voice left to speak for him. And in the end, it was that voice that made sure the truth was heard.